The Pentagon revolts. Why America's generals are turning on Trump. America's military elite thought it governed above politics. Donald Trump disagreed. There are moments when an empire realizes its ruling institutions no longer trust one another, not publicly. At first, the symptoms emerge indirectly, through leaks, through resignations, through speeches carefully phrased as constitutional concern, through retired officials suddenly discovering a taste for television interviews, through warnings that sound less like policy disagreements than coded distress signals from the upper floors of the state. America has entered such a moment, a widening circle of retired generals. Former national security officials and veterans of the post-Cold War security establishment have begun openly criticizing Donald Trump in unusually stark terms. Some warn of creeping authoritarianism. Others accuse him of politicizing the military. Several speak openly about threats to constitutional norms and civilian-military balance. To liberal America, this appears reassuring. Responsible guardians are defending democracy from populist excess. To Trump's supporters, it confirms precisely the opposite, that unelected institutions have become political actors masquerading as neutral custodians of the republic. Both interpretations contain enough truth to make the situation combustible. That is the problem. America's emerging crisis is not reducible to a morality play between democracy and dictatorship, nor between patriots and extremists. It is a structural conflict between two competing theories of the American state. The first theory, dominant since the end of the Cold War, holds that the United States is best governed through stable institutional continuity, professional bureaucracies, alliance systems, technocratic expertise, and an internationalist military elite capable of managing global order regardless of electoral turbulence. The second theory, embodied chaotic but powerfully by Trumpism, holds that these same institutions evolved into a semi-autonomous managerial class insulated from democratic accountability and hostile to populist disruption. This argument has now reached the Pentagon. That is why it matters. The Republic of Permanent Institutions. Modern America likes to describe itself as a democracy of elections. In practice, it also functions as a civilization of institutions. Presidents arrive every 4 years, occasionally 8. But the machinery beneath them persists: intelligence agencies, military commands, regulatory bureaucracies, diplomatic corps, central banks, alliance systems, procurement networks, and sprawling security architectures operating across continents. This permanence is not sinister. Large powers require continuity. Empires, especially, depend upon it. America's global system after 1945 could not have functioned if every election reset strategic doctrine entirely. NATO, nuclear deterrence, carrier fleets, intelligence alliances, and financial systems require bureaucratic durability extending far beyond individual administrations. Thus, emerged what might be called the permanent republic, an America governed partly through elections and partly through managerial continuity. For decades, the arrangement worked well enough because elite consensus remained broad. Republicans and Democrats fought over culture war symbolism while agreeing on free markets, globalization, military primacy, liberal internationalism, NATO expansion, and the maintenance of American hegemony. Even fierce critics of Washington accepted the architecture of the system itself. Trump did not. That is why he frightened the establishment long before he entered office. Trump's heresy: Washington can tolerate corruption, it can tolerate vanity, it can tolerate ideological swings. What it struggles to tolerate is doctrinal rebellion against the legitimacy of the post-Cold War order itself. Trump committed precisely that offense. He mocked NATO as a protection racket. He described the Iraq War as catastrophic stupidity. He attacked intelligence agencies. He questioned alliance obligations. He treated foreign policy orthodoxy not as sacred strategic wisdom but as the failed ideology of a decadent ruling class. This was not how presidents were supposed to speak. American political culture traditionally allowed criticism of execution, never of premise. Presidents could complain that wars were poorly managed. They were not expected to question whether the entire liberal interventionist project had become strategically hollow. Trump did exactly that. His rise exposed something uncomfortable. Millions of Americans no longer believed their governing institutions were competent, honest, or acting in the national interest. After Iraq, Afghanistan, the fiscal crisis, deindustrialization, and decades of polarization, institutional trust had eroded badly. Trump did not create this distrust. He harvested it, brutally. The deep state, a conspiracy theory with bureaucratic foundations. Few phrases trigger establishment Washington more reliably than deep state. The term sounds theatrical, conspiratorial, and vaguely foreign, as though America were run by cigarette-smoking colonels in dark rooms, yet beneath the melodrama lies a simpler and less absurd observation: all mature states develop permanent institutional ecosystems with their own interests, assumptions, and cultural cohesion. America's national security establishment is one such ecosystem. It consists not merely of government agencies but of an interconnected class structure. Pentagon officials, intelligence officers, contractors, think tank analysts, defense lobbyists, retired generals, NATO planners, diplomats, cybersecurity executives, and the vast consulting economy orbiting American power. Most members of this system genuinely believe they are protecting the republic. Many are competent, some are exceptional. But institutions protecting themselves eventually begin confusing institutional continuity with national virtue. This is where populism enters. Trump's central political insight was not ideological sophistication. It was psychological clarity. He recognized that millions of voters increasingly suspected that unelected institutions constrained elected power while claiming neutrality. The more aggressively establishment figures denied this possibility, the more believable it appeared. When intelligence officials intervened publicly in political controversies, when former generals issued warnings about democratic collapse, and when bureaucratic resistance became visible through leaks and anonymous briefings, Trump's narrative gained strength. His supporters concluded the establishment was proving his point in real time. The officer class discovers politics. America's military elite long cultivated an image of constitutional distance from partisan struggle. Unlike militaries in unstable states, the Pentagon presented itself as professional, technocratic, disciplined, and institutionally apolitical. Retired officers occasionally endorsed candidates, but the officer corps avoided overt political tribalism. That restraint was strategic. The American military's legitimacy depends heavily on public perception that it serves the Constitution rather than factions. Vietnam reinforced this lesson painfully. Watergate deepened it further. After the traumas of the 1960s and 1970s, America carefully rebuilt a model of civil-military relations designed to keep the armed forces outside overt partisan conflict. Generals advised, civilians decided, the military obeyed. The arrangement required mutual trust. Trump shattered much of it. The Milley moment. No figure symbolizes this rupture more clearly than Mark Milley. To establish America, Mr. Milley became a defender of constitutional stability during the chaos surrounding the 2020 election and the aftermath of the January 6 riot. To Trump's movement, he became evidence that parts of the military establishment considered themselves guardians against elected leadership they distrusted. The symbolism mattered enormously. In constitutional democracies, civilian control of the military is foundational. Yet Trumpists increasingly argue that elements within the national security bureaucracy selectively interpret civilian authority through ideological filters. This accusation may be exaggerated. It is not entirely imaginary. Modern bureaucracies rarely engage in open insubordination. They resist more subtly, through delay, through leaks, through procedural obstruction, through internal coalition building, through selective interpretation, through strategic non-cooperation. Trump's presidency convinced millions of conservatives that America's permanent institutions had become active political participants. That belief fundamentally altered the relationship between populism and the state. Trump's counter-revolution. Most analyses of Trump misunderstand his real project. He is often described as anti-establishment. In fact, he seeks not to destroy institutions but to capture and repurpose them. Trump admires power deeply. He likes military spectacle, executive authority, strong borders, coercive symbolism, patriotic nationalism, and centralized command. What he distrusts is institutional autonomy. His conflict with the Pentagon is therefore not anti-military. It is an anti-managerial military. Trump does not object to force. He objects to independent power centers within the state that are not personally or ideologically aligned with him. This distinction explains the growing alarm among retired generals. Their fear is not merely policy disagreement, it is a structural transformation. They worry the military could gradually evolve from a constitutional institution into a politically aligned executive instrument, not dramatically, administratively. That is how modern systems change. Politicization rarely arrives wearing boots. Americans often imagine democratic collapse theatrically, tanks in streets, martial law. Suspended constitutions. Modern institutional erosion usually looks far more bureaucratic, appointments become ideological, promotions reward loyalty, career incentives shift subtly, dissent grows professionally risky. Officials begin calculating political consequences alongside institutional duty. No single moment appears revolutionary, yet cumulative transformation occurs. The retired generals speaking publicly about Trump understand this dynamic because they have spent careers studying unstable states abroad. Ironically, many now fear aspects of those pathologies appearing at home. Their concern centers not on imminent dictatorship but on gradual erosion of institutional neutrality. If officers begin viewing themselves as aligned with partisan camps, the military's constitutional legitimacy weakens, and once public trust fractures along partisan lines, restoring institutional neutrality becomes extremely difficult. The irony of liberal militarism. There is, however, a delicious irony embedded within establishment panic over Trump. For years, America's national security elite defended expansive executive powers in the name of defending liberal democracy abroad. After September 11, Washington normalized surveillance expansion, indefinite military operations, drone assassinations, emergency powers, and broad executive security authority. Critics warning about civil liberties were often dismissed as naive. Now many of the same institutions fear concentrated executive power because a populist outsider controls it. The imperial presidency became alarming only after it ceased being reliably managed by establishment figures. Empires frequently discover constitutional anxieties late in their own life cycle, usually after control of the machinery becomes contested. The crisis of expertise. The generals face another problem: credibility. For decades, America's military and foreign policy elite promised strategic competence. Instead, the public witnessed Iraq descending into catastrophe, Afghanistan ending in humiliation, trillion-dollar wars with ambiguous outcomes, endless interventions, and growing domestic dysfunction. The officer class still speaks in the language of constitutional guardianship and strategic responsibility. Substantial portions of the electorate hear something else. A failed managerial aristocracy defending institutional prestige. This perception may be unfair to many military professionals. Politically, it hardly matters. Trust once lost rarely returns through official statements, especially in populist eras. NATO's quiet panic. America's allies are watching this struggle with mounting anxiety. For decades, NATO's greatest strategic advantage was not merely American strength but American continuity. European governments assumed, administrations changed, Congress quarreled, elections became noisy, yet the underlying strategic architecture remained intact. That assumption now looks fragile, if American military leadership becomes politicized. Alliance management grows unpredictable. If officers are selected increasingly through ideological alignment, allies must calculate not only policy but factional volatility within Washington itself. Europe's deeper fear is not abandonment, it is incoherence. An empire can survive strategic overreach, it struggles to survive institutional fragmentation. The cultural war reaches the barracks. The conflict is also cultural. Conservatives increasingly accuse military leadership of embracing progressive managerial ideology, diversity initiatives, identity frameworks, bureaucratic activism, and social engineering detached from combat effectiveness. Military leaders counter that modern armed forces must adapt to social realities and demographic change. Both sides partly misunderstand the other. For conservatives, the issue is not merely policy. It is symbolism. The armed forces traditionally represented one of the last nationally unifying institutions in American life, hierarchical, patriotic, masculine, disciplined. As cultural values shifted, conservatives began perceiving parts of the military establishment as aligned with elite progressive norms rather than traditional civic nationalism. Trump exploited this brilliantly. He positioned himself not against the military rank and file but against its managerial leadership. Class, that distinction proved politically potent. The end of elite consensus. The deeper story here extends beyond Trump himself. The post-Cold War American order depended upon broad elite agreement regarding globalization, interventionism, technocracy, liberal capitalism, and American primacy. That consensus is collapsing. The fracture now cuts across universities, media, intelligence agencies, corporations, courts, and increasingly the military. This is why establishment figures react to Trump with such unusual intensity. They do not merely see a disruptive politician, they see the possible end of the governing philosophy that structured American power for 3 decades, and they may be correct. America's slow constitutional mutation. America is unlikely to experience classic authoritarian collapse. Its institutions remain too decentralized, too adversarial, and too constitutionally entrenched. The greater danger is subtler, a long-term politicization of institutional legitimacy. In such systems, courts are viewed as partisan, intelligence agencies as ideological, elections as manipulated, media as tribal, and military institutions as factionally aligned. Once enough citizens lose faith in institutional neutrality, democratic systems become permanently unstable even without formal constitutional breakdown. That process may already be underway. The retired generals criticizing Trump are reacting not merely to one man's behavior but to this broader trajectory. They fear the armed forces could eventually become another contested institution inside America's tribal conflict. History suggests such fears are not irrational. Republics depend heavily on shared belief in procedural legitimacy. When that belief dissolves, every institution becomes suspect, including the military, especially the military. The state after liberalism. Trump did not invent America's crisis, he exposed it. The United States spent decades constructing a managerial empire governed through technocratic confidence and institutional continuity. That model delivered immense power abroad. It also generated growing alienation at home. Many Americans came to feel they were ruled by systems they could not meaningfully influence. Trade regimes, security bureaucracies, global markets, administrative agencies, and cultural elites increasingly detached from ordinary social experience. Trump's genius, if one chooses to call it that, was recognizing the emotional potential of institutional distrust before establishment America understood how deep it had become. He transformed resentment into political identity. The establishment responded by defending norms, expertise, and institutional continuity, all sensible things. Unfortunately, institutions weakened by strategic failure rarely persuade populations through appeals to trust alone. The general's dilemma. The retired generals criticizing Trump therefore face an impossible dilemma. If they remain silent, they fear institutional erosion. If they speak publicly, they accelerate perceptions that the military establishment itself has become political. Every intervention risks confirming Trump's narrative, yet many clearly believe silence would be worse. This alone reveals how deeply elite confidence has fractured. The old rules no longer seem adequate even to those who once enforced them. The new American question. For much of modern history, America asked, who should govern? Increasingly, the real question has become, what exactly is governing? Elected officials, permanent bureaucracies, courts, corporate systems, security institutions, networked elites? The answer, inconveniently, is all of them. Trumpism emerged from popular frustration with this ambiguity. The military establishment's reaction reflects fear that the ambiguity may now be resolved through populist capture rather than constitutional balance. Neither side trusts the other enough to compromise comfortably. That is why the conflict feels so bitter. It is not merely electoral, it is existential. The Republic enters a new era. America is not descending into fascism, nor is it simply experiencing routine partisan turbulence. It is undergoing a renegotiation of power between democratic populism and institutional continuity. Such renegotiations are historically volatile, especially inside empires. The retired general's sense of this. Trump senses it too. Both sides understand that the old post-Cold War consensus, the comfortable arrangement under which elections changed personalities while institutions preserved strategic continuity, is ending. Something harsher is emerging in its place, a republic where institutions themselves become partisan battlegrounds. Once that process begins, it rarely reverses quickly. The danger is not dictatorship, it is permanent mutual suspicion between the state and society attempting to control it. The condition is colder, more modern, and potentially more enduring.